If you've seen the recent Sandman spin-off show Dead Boy Detectives, then you're well aware who Night Nurse is. She works for death as a means of helping dead children find their final destination, either that being heaven or hell. The character is played by Ruth Connell, who while isn't a villain per se, she certainly is antagonistic. The character was also previously a part of the attempted original backdoor pilot from Doom Patrol, and while these shows take place in different canon and the majority of the characters recasted, Night Nurse is surprisingly the only exception to that rule, with the character still having been played by Ruth Connell. Although this one is very different. Instead, this Night Nurse is almost spider-like, and much more of an actual villain and demonic. She also throws up on the Doom Patrol and turns them into zombies in another episode. In the original Dead Boy Detective comics, there isn't a character called Night Nurse, however there is a character outside of them with a nearly identical name. Meet Nightmare Nurse, a character who was introduced in the New 52 Justice League Dark comics. She's a mystical being who helps out those who are ill from supernatural means. Why did I say means so emphasize means? And while her patients are certainly of all ages, she has spent quite a bit of time helping wounded children. She's also said to be a timeless immortal being. And transdimensional. Which is exactly how the character Night Nurse describes herself. You also might recognize the character Nightmare Nurse from Constantine City of Demons, where the character would appear as a major player, as well as being far less demonic than the comic counterpart of the character. Which was likely because the character on the show is more heroic and more of an actual character opposed to the character from the comics who's more of a demonic presence. That is much more of an anti-hero opposed to actually being an actual hero. From face value, there are some similarities in Night Nurse. While their jobs are technically different, in fact, in ways the complete opposite, with Night Nurse helping dead children go to heaven, while Nightmare Nurse attempts to save them from going to heaven or sometimes hell. However, they also have nearly identical names with nearly identical origins. In fact, the original version of Night Nurse from Doom Patrol is even more like Nightmare Nurse. That by the character being more demonic, although, like said, that would be dropped when the character would appear on Dead Boy Detectives. Who, by the way, like Nightmare Nurse, is actually an anti-hero opposed to the version who appeared on Doom Patrol who's actually a villain. So they kind of swapped out different elements of the character of Nightmare Nurse between the takes of the character. Now their names and similar themes have resulted in many labeling Night Nurse as being Nightmare Nurse, from Comic Vine to DC Wiki to the Sandman wiki page. And I will be honest, I don't think I'm quite convinced. I do think the character certainly has elements of Nightmare Nurse from the comics, however I wouldn't say that she's exactly an adaptation of the character, at least not yet. Potentially she could be later on in Season 2. However, as of right now, I think the character is more inspired by Nightmare Nurse, opposed to actually being an adaptation of Nightmare Nurse. But that's just my own personal opinion. Which you of course can disagree with, and you can think the character very much is Nightmare Nurse. However, if she's intended to actually be Nightmare Nurse, that would make her one of the very few characters in this universe who didn't originate from Vertigo Comics. That being with Lyta Hall, Hector Hall, Jade Walker, and the latter's abusive foster dad and neglectful foster mom. Crystal technically doesn't count because even though the character did appear after DC had already absorbed Vertigo Comics again, the comic itself was very much still listed under a Vertigo comic title. Therefore, technically she did first appear in a Vertigo comic. Now, while I couldn't find anyone from the show itself saying the character is Nightmare Nurse, I did find someone to be in the same vein as the Sandman, when it comes to reusing and recycling concepts. Which means Nightmare Nurse very much could be one of them, that as Night Nurse. And, like said, I'm not entirely convinced, but if that is the case, that is a pretty cool idea, to revamp the character as a different person. Similar to how the Sandman comics did it with many other characters from DC. So to kind of reboot the character in a different setting, a different storytelling, I think is a pretty interesting idea, and I think it definitely worked if that was their intent. I do think the character Night Nurse overall works altogether, even if she is Nightmare Nurse or not. However, I think it would make sense if she actually was, or at the very least, like said, inspired by the character from the comics. Because Nightmare Nurse isn't exactly the most popular character. She certainly has fans, including myself. I think the character has some promise. But she hasn't really appeared all that much. In fact, less than 50 issues. So she would be a good candidate to revamp as a different character in a different setting. And in this storytelling, and this environment of sort of supernatural environment, that is different than the previous when the character appeared in the comics, I think it does work. Although, yet again, that is if the character is actually meant to be Nightmare Nurse and is an original character, which I think that she also very much could be. Overall, if or isn't, I think the character of Night Nurse has some promise, and I'm really excited to see her next season working with the boys, which of course will likely be miserable for her, and bring a bunch of great comedy. I think the character overall has a lot of potential. And I like characters like this, who are not exactly villains but still antagonistic, and you get why, she's just trying to do her job. I even felt bad for the character when they went back on their deal, because she did follow through by opening a gate to hell for them. Which, of course, yes, Edwin and Charles had to be on Earth because that's the whole point of the show, but at the same time, she did do her part of the deal, so I kind of felt bad that she didn't get anything in return. I do think the character very much has some inspiration from Nightmare Nurse, but I don't think that she's exactly Nightmare Nurse in adaptation, but more in inspiration. At the very least, as of right now, I think potentially in the future, she might actually become the Nightmare Nurse, which I think could be a cool storyline for her. And for this show, which by the way, I highly recommend. It is a very good show. If you love the Sandman show, then you'll love this show. So do yourself a favor and go watch it, or at the very least, watch like the first 10 minutes of the show, because I think in that time you'll get an understanding of if you like it or not. And that's it. What are your thoughts? Do you think that Night Nurse is very much Nightmare Nurse, or do you think the character is just inspired, or a completely different character? Like always, please like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!